In this lecture, we will be examining the conflict known as the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, which was an armed revolt by Jews of the Warsaw Ghetto against Nazi occupiers. The uprising took place from April 19th until May 16th of 1943. This event was the largest single rebellion by the Jews during the Second World War, and the uprising was also the first mass revolt in Nazi-occupied Europe during the Second World War. As we indicated in an earlier lecture, the Nazis established at least 1,000 ghettos in German-occupied Poland and the Soviet Union alone. The first ghetto was created in 1939. The first large-scale ghetto at Łódź, the Polish city of Łódź, was created in April 1940. The Warsaw Ghetto was set up in October 1940. This was the largest ghetto in Nazi-occupied Europe, and it featured about 400,000 Jews at its peak in an area about 1.3 square miles. Starting in 1940, the Nazis began the process of relocating and detaining on a permanent basis the 3 million Jews who lived in Poland. Approximately 30% of Warsaw's population at the peak was packed into this very small area. Before the death camp deportations from the Warsaw Ghetto even started, tens of thousands of ghetto inhabitants had already died in the first 2 years from malnutrition, disease, and killings by the Nazis. In these tightly packed conditions, diseases such as typhus, dysentery, and typhoid spread very quickly. Food rations were paltry. The official Nazi food rationing system called for every resident to receive 800 calories a day in the ghetto. Itself an incredibly small number, but recent estimates suggest that some residents averaged less than 300 calories per day. By comparison, the FDA recommends the average adult male with a height of 6 feet and a weight of 175 pounds to need about 2,400 calories to maintain that weight. So figure that on average, many residents of the ghetto were receiving 1/8 of what it would take to keep an average-sized adult male alive. Sanitation, quite inadequate for the hundreds of thousands of inhabitants in this very small area. This area formerly contained a population less than 1/3 of the peak in its use by the Nazis as a walled enclosure. In many cases, hundreds of people had to share a single bathroom. Space was at a premium. Sometimes a dozen or more families shared a small apartment, and that was the lucky ones who actually had official housing. Many others were just forced out into the streets. Yet in spite of these restrictions, Jews managed to maintain a fairly active and involved social life in the Warsaw Ghetto, trying to make the best of a bad situation in very tough times. Mass deportations of Warsaw Jews occurred in the middle of the year of 1942, beginning as early as May of 1942 and continuing well into September. Pictured here is Adam Chernikov, the leader of the ghetto's Jewish Council, or Judenrat, was forced by the Nazis to make available lists of Jews and their locations in the ghetto. Chernikov has a rather checkered historical legacy. He's been at times accused of being a Nazi collaborator, but I think most historians agree he was in an extremely difficult position, being sort of an intermediary between the Nazis and the Jews. After Nazi authorities refused to grant exemption from deportation for the children of an orphanage, Chernikov committed suicide in July 1942. He left a note that read, "They demand me to kill children of my own nation with my own hands. I have nothing left to do but die." Up to 300,000 Jews from the Warsaw Ghetto died at the Treblinka concentration camp after the deportations. When the deportations began Jewish resistance leaders initially decided against military action, at least direct action, thinking deportees had been sent to labor camps. In a matter of months, though, word made its way back to Warsaw of the existence of death camps, and the uprising, then the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, began in response to this news. In January 1943, the Nazis began a second round of deportation of Polish Jews from Warsaw. Members of the Jewish Military Union, joined by the Jewish Combat Organization, engaged the Nazis in direct combat. Despite these attacks, the Nazis still managed to deport Jews from the ghetto, although at a much reduced rate. Jewish resistance groups began building defensive positions within the ghetto, and they also executed people they believed to be Nazi collaborators. The resistance fighters organized themselves for what they believed to be a very difficult and perhaps protracted struggle against the Nazis. By the end of January, the ghetto fighters totaled about 400 individuals. This number would grow to approximately 1,000 combatants, at least armed combatants, by April of 1943. Jewish insurgents typically fought with pistols and revolvers. These firearms are of course not very effective in combat, while being almost useless at targets of longer distance. The members of the Polish resistance managed to smuggle in a few rifles and some automatic weapons into the ghetto, but these were not in especially significant amounts, and the ammunition, of course, was a critical factor and often in very short supply. Resistance fighters often used improvised explosive devices and frequently used Molotov cocktails in attacks on German targets. The poster on this slide was published by the Jewish Combat Organization. The poster in English reads that all people are equal brothers, brown, white, black, and yellow. To separate peoples, colors, races is but an act of cheating. In addition to smuggling weapons into the ghetto, some Polish resistance units fought inside the ghetto alongside Jewish resistance fighters. Polish fighters fought Nazi troops outside the ghetto as well, and they attempted to break through the walls using explosive devices. The Polish resistance asked Allied forces for help through a number of radio transmissions, seeking Allied help for the Jews of the Warsaw Ghetto. In 1944, after this particular event, the Polish resistance staged a later revolt against the Nazi occupation of Warsaw that would become known simply enough as the Warsaw Uprising. The Nazis at the time of the uprising, the Ghetto Uprising, possessed about 2,100 soldiers that they tried to use in their efforts to quell the uprising. This figure includes a few hundred Polish police officers posted around the border of the ghetto. German forces contained army battalions, some members of the Gestapo, significant amount of anti-aircraft artillery. There was a Ukrainian battalion as well, and also a gang of criminals who'd been released from a nearby prison who offered to round up and execute as many Jews as they could find. Jewish security forces that had been employed by the Gestapo were either executed outright or briefly used in the offensive and then executed by the Gestapo. After Jewish resistance fighters destroyed some armored vehicles and rejected an ultimatum to surrender, the Nazis initiated a plot to methodically burn down the ghetto with explosives and flamethrowers. This decision was based in part on the fact that the Germans had failed to subdue the resistance using standard military tactics. German troops went building to building to set explosive devices and incendiary devices. Anyone they encountered at this time was likely to have been killed on the spot. In the conflict, almost all of the Warsaw resistance leaders were killed by the Germans. Nazis used dogs to find resistance fighters who were hiding in buildings. Smoke grenades, poison gas, tear gas were among the tools used to flush out the combatants. On May 8th of 1943, Nazi troops found the last operational resistance command facility. All remaining leaders, plus a few dozen resistance fighters, died in this last stand. Others of the resistance, refusing to be killed or captured by the Nazis, committed suicide. Some shot themselves, others took cyanide. The uprising officially ended on May 16th of 1943, although there was some sporadic incidents of resistance in the weeks after the official end of the uprising. It is difficult to get an accurate assessment of the casualties of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, and historians have some disagreement as to the number of fighters killed, the civilians killed on both sides. Most historians will argue that somewhere in the neighborhood of 10 to 15,000 Jews died in the ghetto during the revolt. Perhaps as many as 7,000 Jews were burnt alive or died from smoke inhalation. The remaining 50,000 residents of the ghetto were detained and transported to concentration camps. Most ended up in Treblinka, and very few of them survived the Second World War and the Holocaust. Nazi troops probably experienced several hundred casualties. However, due to the fact that the defeat of the Jewish resistance in the ghetto became an important public relations item, Nazi propagandists at the time claimed that only 16 German soldiers died in that one-month uprising. The number's likely much higher than that. Most historians place the number of German soldiers killed in the 75 to 150 range. There may have been some manipulation of the daily records kept by German officers. There may have been some sort of like relocating the positions of soldiers, at least in the records, when they had died. Other records may not have included particular units, but the claims by the Polish resistance and Jewish resistance leaders of 500 to 1,000 casualties is probably too high for this particular event. This brings to a close our brief examination of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising.